Narrowing the gap between rich and poor, Indonesia and China agree to increase minimum wages. Both economies are booming and workers want a piece of the pie. But could raising wages burden production costs and hurt the lowest paid? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sami Zaidan. Well, China and Indonesia are among the fastest growing economies in the world, but they're also witnessing growing social unrest. Millions remain in poverty. Workers are increasingly taking to the streets, holding strikes and protests, pressing their demands for more money. Well, it seems to be working. The countries are now promising to raise minimum wages, but it seems even that can come at a price. Well, in a moment, Margot Ortegas is in Hong Kong for Inside Story. But first, Step Vasson is following developments in Indonesia's capital, Jakarta.
The workers are back here at the palace after a month of protests. They're still not happy. Tens of thousands have gathered here from the metal industry, car factories and electronic factories. They demand a free healthcare scheme, a pension scheme, and they ask the companies to keep their promises to raise the minimum wage, because many have not been paid the raise yet. These continuous protests not only worry the government, but are also of great concern to many companies. Some have already left Indonesia, moving the production abroad, not only out of fear of high costs, but also out of fear of insecurity and instability.
The increase in minimum wage is just one of the steps that the central government has announced in the hopes of putting in place an economic reform plan that should decrease the widening wealth gap in China. Now, this wealth gap is one of the major causes of social unrest that the government has had to deal with over the last few years. Now, particularly as it's in the process of officially transitioning its leadership, the last thing it wants to be seen to be doing is ignoring its people's concern. They need to have a stable social atmosphere at the moment in China, and one of the ways they hope to do that is by making a greater number of their 1 billion people richer than they are right now. China is still dealing with a poverty problem. There are over 128 million people living on less than $1 a day, and the Chinese central government wants to cut that in half in the next 2 years.
Well, let's bring in our guest then in Jakarta, Said Iqbal. He's president of the Federation of the Indonesian Metal Workers Union and leader of the Indonesian Workers' Protest Movement. Joining us from Singapore, Rajiv Biswas, Senior Director and Asia Pacific Chief Economist for IHS Global Insight. And in Kuala Lumpur News Centre, Shan Said, an economist and advisor to companies in the Asia region. Welcome to all of you. Let's start with Shan. So, the poorest paid workers in China and Indonesia seems like they'll be getting a little more money. Isn't that a good thing?
I think the minimum wage will hurt the economies of Indonesia and China, because markets should determine the wage floor of the workers. But if you put a minimum wage rate in the economy, it creates distortion, it creates inefficiencies, and it creates deadweight loss for the economy.
Well,
so
some
I
would
think,
argue, if I could jump in here,
determine the
some would
price.
argue it hasn't really worked in some of the developed countries. There are plenty of people who would argue that leaving markets to do whatever they like has got the whole world into a bit of a financial mess, hasn't it?
I think every system has got some shortcomings. But if you look at Germany, in 2001, Germany was the sick child of Europe. But after 10 years, they enhanced the skill set of the workers, and now Germany is driving the European economy. That's a live example. But if you put a minimum wage rate, and most of it's done by the politicians, and politicians, they don't understand economics, they don't understand finance, they are more interested in holding on to their powers. And that is why it hurts the least skilled workers who get slaughtered when the minimum wage rate is applied, because most of the corporations, they don't accept that, and the markets don't accept that. So I think There are some shortcomings, but markets should determine the wage price of the workers.
All right, let's take those points to Saeed. Of course, you're on the other perspective of this question, aren't you? Are you worried at all, concerned at all about what Shan has been talking about, that a minimum wage in the long run might actually impact negatively, might harm the very people it's supposed to help?
Yeah. You can look, macroeconomic in Indonesia is very growing. Indonesia number second after Chinese in the worldwide economic growth. Indonesia have GDP number 16 in the worldwide. It means Indonesia become the most important countries in the worldwide, the most important country in the G20. But if you can look situation wages in labor in Indonesia, since 15 years ago, labor in Indonesia get very cheaper and low wages. And now you can look Indonesia numbers, ILO data, International Labor Organization, ILO data, number 69 from the 190 countries. And you can look average national minimum in Indonesia, about $140.
Okay, so it's very low in terms of what they pay the workers, agreed. But Shan's point, and people like him would say, having governments come in and raise the minimum wages will make companies to sack the poorest paid and perhaps fill those positions with, I don't know, informals, illegals, and you'll end up hurting your workers.
Yeah, if you look the current condition, you can say yes, the employer said is very expensive and is very high, increasing wages in Indonesia. But you know, since 15 years ago, labor get increasing minimum wage less than 100% from the standard living cost. For example, the last years, 2011, labor get a minimum wage average in national about 89% from the standard living cost. It means each year the labor's debt have the debt 10 until 12% per month. This is very low wages. So since 2 years ago, the labor movement changed mindset. We need standard living costs. Yes, we need investment coming to Indonesia. And the other side, we need fairness. If Indonesia has economic growth become growing, so the other side, the labor, purchasing power from labor also increase. If Indonesia have purchasing power increase, it means the consumption from labor is very increased also.
All right, that's an interesting point you've made. Let's talk about that in a bit, but let's just recap for a second that what we're talking about, of course, the concept of a minimum wage is, of course, not new. It was first established by New Zealand back in 1894. And since then, it has been adopted by a lot of countries. France offers the best deal, 60% of average earnings, working out at $12.40 an hour. New Zealand has agreed on 59%, but of a higher average salary, giving $12.75 an hour. Britain has a standard of 48%. That works out about $9.68 an hour. And the US and Japan, well, they've set their benchmarks at 38% of average salaries, from $6.50 to $7.80. Now, I want to bring Rajiv in before we go back to some of the points which Saeed was making there. As I said, we've got countries, there's plenty of countries who've gone through this. While we're arguing about the effects this will have on the overall economy, on the labour force itself, what does past experience tell us from countries which have actually gone through this? Is it good? Is it bad?
I think it's a very complex issue. It depends on the framework of the country you're looking at. But I want to make the point that if we look at China, one of the big concerns is the growing disparities in incomes, particularly between coastal China and inland provinces. There's a lot of concern about the risk of social unrest. And imbalances have developed in the Chinese economy with a lot of the benefits of economic growth going to the profits of the corporate sector. And one of the new government focuses in policy is to try to redress the balance, because consumption as a share of GDP has declined for 30 years and is now only 1/3 of GDP. And this is not a sound balance for the future of the economy. So in the last few years, we have seen quite high increases in minimum wage increases for workers in China, and that's starting to help in boosting private consumption and retail spending growth. It's not a magic solution, but over, say, the next decade, we would expect to see that consumption as a share of GDP should gradually start to improve, and the corporate profits share of GDP may decline a bit. In the case of Indonesia, I think it's probably a different balance of issues that needs to be confronted. Although we have seen very significant minimum wage increases, particularly in Jakarta, I think the issue confronting the corporate sector is that wages are still very competitive by Asian standards in Indonesia, but they can't forever compete just on pure low-cost, unskilled labor. And corporates have to be serious and address the issue. How are they going to link wages growth with productivity? And I think this is where we need to see much more action in Indonesia from the corporate sector and from government to boost productivity, which you need to do by vocational training and education.
You've made some good points
and
there.
Infrastructure.
All right, let's see if we could take this discussion back to Shan. I think both of our previous speakers have made a common point, at least, and that don't we need to improve domestic wages in order to improve domestic consumption and for the overall economy to keep growing? You can't keep focusing only on the corporate profit.
I think I will take this point further when he said that productivity levels. So I think productivity levels are more important than consumption. And it goes back to productivity levels. Once you enhance the productivity levels of the workers, eventually the consumption will go up. An economy cannot be played like a piano, that you press a fiscal key and you get the right job creation notes. It has to do with prudent economic policies that effectively use the monetary policy, that make sure that they have the right fiscal balance in order to achieve a healthy GDP growth and economic progression. And if you look at Indonesia in the last 15 years, from 97 to date, in the last 7 to 8 years, the economy has actually picked up. From 97 to 2003, the economy was achieving a subpar growth because of structural issues. Even at this point of time, Indonesia has got a lot of structural issues. They have infrastructure woes. They have trade volumes were decreasing in the last quarter. So these are some of the challenges that the Indonesian government and the Indonesian economy would confront going forward.
Okay, but how do you increase that? Just to go to a point you made there, how would you increase productivity levels and expect consumption to also increase without some form of wage increase for the workers?
I think the government needs to improve the skill set of the employees, just like the German government did when they were called the sixth child of Europe in 2001. And now if you look at Germany, the manufacturing sector is very strong. The skill set of the workers are much higher as compared to the US workers or even the Japanese workers. So I think the government needs to enhance the skill set of the workers, and they need to adopt job creation strategies that matches with those productivity levels.
All right, let's take that point to Said. Is the real solution here, rather than increasing wages alone, to really increase the skill set of workers?
Yeah, you know, the situation in Indonesia, a lot of companies use the outsourcing workers and contract workers. More than average in labor intensive and capital intensive, the companies use average about more than 70%, it means the labor get only minimum wage. This is minimum wage policies. You can look, if labor only get minimum wage, it's very poor. Long times is poor for the labor. For example, this years in Jakarta in capital city in Indonesia, labor get minimum wage about 2.2 million rupiah, about $240 per month. Labor spending for the transportation allowance about 400,000 rupiah, and then rent of the house 400,000 rupiah, 800 rupiah for transportation allowance and house rent of a house. It means labor the real get only about 1.4 million, about $150. You should be live only $550 per month for the labor. This is poor. Yes,
okay.
If you like,
you said it's
look
cruel there. I'll tell you what it also is.
The real consumption is very low.
It's very interesting, and some would say controversial for people all around the world. I think this question is one that many countries are facing. It's causing reaction from all over the place. Let's get you some of the reaction that we've been getting from Facebook to this show. Thomas Brown says, I'm in Indonesia right now, and I know many companies that have just refused to pay their workers the new minimum wages. Asabi Magani says, provide jobs, empower the poor. How does your minimum wage increase jobs for the jobless? Doms Flores says, the rich become richer, the poor become poorer. Government should pass laws closing the gap. Well, Eken Lowenson says, when wages are raised, coupled with taxes, people may lose jobs. But then they will receive government support. That doesn't reduce production. Now, let's take this question, if we could, to Rajiv. And an important point made here by one of our Facebook followers. To what extent, even if a government makes up these minimum wage laws, to what extent is it actually respected in places like Indonesia and China? And even if it is respected, to what extent does it really impact a country where a large proportion of workers are classified as the, workers in the informal sector?
Oh, this is a very good point. I agree with you that, and with the commentator from Facebook, that many will not be benefiting from these minimum wage standards because it's very hard to enforce. And in the informal economy or in some of the small to medium enterprises, you're not going to get enforcement of those standards. But nevertheless, in significant parts in the urban centers of Indonesia, or more so probably in China, you are going to get these coming through. So even though it's not universally implemented, nevertheless it will have some impact. And I think in the end you do need to look at a broader approach of linking productivity to wages growth. And particularly in the case of Indonesia, government for decades has very much neglected the development of education and vocational training. The standards are very low, and you need a huge effort, which the government's only just beginning, to create a compact between industry and workers to try to boost productivity levels. And of course the educational sector is critical in that process. You also need a huge ramp up of infrastructure, because that will boost productivity as well. And government is starting to do that in Indonesia. China obviously much further ahead along that path. But I think these are the sort of changes you need. On the positive side, what we're seeing is a lot of foreign interest in investing in Indonesian manufacturing. That's really revved up in the last 3 or 4 years. Is that going to be maintained if there's significant wage increases? It depends if it's linked to productivity, but I think the key here is that Indonesian wages are still very low by ASEAN standards. If you look around at Thailand, Malaysia, or even at China, Indonesia is still very competitive. So you don't expect a flight of FDI, foreign direct investment and capital is going to go and look for cheaper places if wages are going up in Jakarta? No, because they want to invest in Indonesia, because that's where the consumer market is. Where is this investment going? It's going to sectors like consumer retail goods, auto sector for the domestic market. So they do want to be based in Indonesia for the domestic market, but we need a better approach to productivity so that the wage gains are linked to improving quality of production.
Well, talking about the Asian economies, let's get a measure of how they're actually doing. Mixed results here, but still the envy of most other countries. China's economy, the world's second largest, for example, grew by more than 7.5% last year, albeit that is down from a little over 9% in 2011. The Philippine economy exceeded forecasts to grow by 6.6% in 2012, surging past the previous year's mark of 4.4%. And Indonesia not far behind at 6.2%, down just a little on 2011. Now compare that to Europe's largest economy, Germany, which could only manage growth of less than 1% last year, and that was already down from a modest 3% the year before. Now I'd like to take a question here to Shan. Europe is struggling, a lot of developed countries are struggling right now, but even some of the research, and I know you can find research to almost back up whatever position you want to take on this, but some of the research, for example, researchers at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst and California at Berkeley, they compared restaurant employment levels across counties with different minimum wage levels between 1990 and 2006. Now they found what they call no adverse effects on employment from a higher minimum wage. Now if that's the case in parts of the world which are really struggling, I take your point about it might be better to focus more on productivity and skill set, but if it's not hurting, why is it a bad thing to give workers a little bigger piece of the pie?
Yes, to some extent it is correct. You're looking at the other side of the coin, and this research did prove that if you increase a minimum wage and the restaurant to restaurant workers, they actually get a better salary structure. But having said that, if you look at the Cato Institute policy paper, the negative impact of minimum wage on 21st June last year, written by Mark Wilson, he clearly proved with empirical evidence that minimum wage rates actually hurt the economy, because once you artificially raise the price of the labor, it actually curbs the demand side, and it actually hurts those workers with least skill set. So yes, I agree to your point to some extent, but on the other side of the coin, there are research that which is empirically proven that there are something that it will hurt the economy and the productivity of those workers in the long run.
All right, Saeed, very briefly, is giving a 40% pay rise to workers in Jakarta, is that gradual, logical, or is that too much? Is that just politicians trying to improve their standings at the next elections?
If you look labor needs and necessary, I think is very fair. Increase the 40% for increasing wages for this years, because like I explained you, since 15 years ago, labor get the very, very low wages, controlled by government, less than 100% from standard living costs. But now labor movement become the strong to negotiate, strong to the action, strong pressure to government and employer association. Please, if you get the benefit, you share, you distribute to the labor, make the increasing purchasing power the labor. Okay. Yes, also we need skill and productivity from labor, but you should be understood. The minimum wage not relation to the productivity and skill.
All right,
the minimum wage
you've made that
safety net. This is my opinion.
All right, you made that very clear. Let's thank our guests, Saeed Iqbal, Rajiv Biswas and Shan Saeed. And thank
You're
you
welcome.
for joining us on this edition of
welcome.
Inside Story.
Thank you.
As always, you can find the programme and many more at aljazeera.com. Leave us your comments too if you like. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.